India and China and Russia, and the way in which the changing political landscape is affecting Indian foreign policy. I'm going to say mostly, I'm going to look at mostly at those three countries, but of course these shifts do create new opportunities for the United States. And the question is, how will India's relations with India in particular, how will the United States' relations with India in particular change as a result, particularly perhaps, of the Chinese policies that we've been talking about previous sessions in the South and East China Seas. And I think you'll see that I think the changes are going to be muted. And they're going to be muted because of fairly deeply entrenched attitudes in the political cultures of both countries. And perhaps I can give you just a couple of examples which may illustrate the problem. Shortly after 9/11, I was in India and I was lecturing at the National Law College in Bangalore. The American bombing campaign in Afghanistan was in full flood, if you could have floods of bombing campaigns. And I was giving, not uncritical, but basically trying to explain why I thought this campaign was being waged, and what its strengths and weaknesses were. I don't think I have ever had a more hostile reaction from an audience. When we stopped, I was criticized as being a kind of paid-up agent of the United States in the most virulent way, went round the table. And then, as always happens in Indian audiences, the seminar came to an end and everyone switched from full aggressive mode to being exceedingly polite and friendly. And I went round the table and said, what are you going to be doing next? All of these people I was lecturing to had just finished their LLM legal training program. And every single one of them was going on to an American law school. Just shortly at that time, about that time, an Indian journalist working in the United States wrote an article in which he explained this phenomenon. And he said, you'll find throughout India there is this attitude, Yankee go home and take me with you. And that is a very deeply entrenched attitude within public opinion. America remains an enormously attractive magnet as a society, and its foreign policy is regarded with deep, deep suspicion. And second story, before I get into my real material, you'll know that, well, perhaps you won't know, but at the moment there are some former British servicemen who are languishing in an Indian jail because, having retired from the military, they sought employment. They are now employed by an American private security firm, and their ship, which was allegedly engaged in piracy control work, was seized in Indian waters, and it was found that the ship was carrying arms which had not been declared, and all attempts to get them out of jail in Bombay have failed. Now this is quite illustrative of a general Indian attitude that it is not, even now, and I'm going to say that suggests that many things have changed, it's not going to be pushed about by outside powers. To revert to the main subject I want to talk about, there's much talk these days about a sea change in India's foreign policy. Of the three fixed points that have mapped Indian foreign policy for much of the period since 1947, only the conviction, and it's an Indian conviction, that India is a natural hegemon in its own immediate neighborhood remains largely intact. The other two, an ambivalence often shading into outright suspicion of the West in general, and the United States in particular, and the need to manage its relations with its two geopolitically significant neighbors, China and Russia, in ways that will best contribute to Indian development while minimizing the chances of conflict, are arguably more contested now than at any time since independence. In my remarks this morning, I want to try and look at how the government of India views this changing landscape of international affairs and its own position within it. If we ask what are the key drivers of Indian foreign policy, in broad terms, they do not differ very much from that of other countries. The government seeks to defend and advance its national interests, defined in strategic, by which it largely means territorial integrity terms, in developmental, by which it largely means economic growth and human welfare terms, and reputational, in which it means how are we going to become and have recognized our great power status, and particularly how are we going to make it into the UN Security Council. In all three of these aims, its relationship with China is the most problematic. The country's defeat by China in the short war of 1962 still rankles, although the modernization of the Indian armed forces over the past 54 years make any repeat or any sort of knockout blow by the Chinese pretty unlikely. But while the country's unresolved border disputes with China in Arundel Pradesh and the Aksai Chin have not prevented China emerging as India's most important trading partner, and while the relatively stronger performance of the Indian than the Chinese economy at the present time may strengthen India's leverage in Sino-Indian economic exchanges, these disputes, as well as China's maritime expansion in India's immediate neighborhood, certainly limit India's constructive engagement in China, in China's one band, one road strategy. They also make it unlikely that China will lift its effective veto on any reform of the UN Security Council that includes India as a permanent member. And once again, rather as in the story I told about the United States, I think it's worth pointing out there's a difference in government-to-government relations and societal relations. And it's not always easy to see how these two interface. Certainly, because there's a very famous Tibetan monastery in Arundel Pradesh, it becomes, particularly at election time, particularly when the Dalai Lama visits it, it becomes a point of dispute between China and India. And both China and India have militarized that particular frontier quite dramatically. But if you were to, as a friend of mine, Indian friend of mine did, if you were to go to Arundel Pradesh during the Kali festival, of Kali Puja, major Indian festival, when people sell small images in the markets of Kali, and the markets are full of these small images, and you pick one up and buy it for your private use, and you turn it over, and what do you find? It's made in China. So at the local level, even cultural goods of a Hindu variety are manufactured just across the border in China. The Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, is widely credited with having injected a new dynamism and energy into Indian foreign policy. And he has certainly proved himself to be a very adroit diplomatic maneuverer. Although whether this shift is more than change in the mood music remains to be seen. The reason for caution lies not so much in the fact that the broad architecture of the new policy was designed by his predecessor, although that is true. You wouldn't ever think it was true if you listened to the rhetoric of the government, but it was true. As in the two givens that will ultimately trump the rhetoric and frame Indian foreign policy, whoever rules in Delhi. The first is the historical legacy of the partition of British India. And the second is two aspects of geopolitics to which I've already referred. The fact that India dwarfs its immediate neighbors, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan. And the fact that its wider neighborhood includes two nuclear powers and permanent members of the Security Council. Both these givens not only interact with one another, but also limit the range of foreign policy options. And let me consider each of them in turn. Until shortly before the Indian National Congress achieved independence, midnight on the 15th of August 1947, a date which really started the whole period of decolonization, European withdrawal. Until that day, the Congress opposed partition because, however the deed was done, India would remain a major Muslim country. India's Muslim population is less than 15% of its total, which is over a billion now. But with a total population of that size, of over a billion, this still leaves India as the world's third most populous Muslim country after Indonesia, and only 0.1% behind Pakistan itself. It was this demography that ultimately dictated the secularism with which the original Congress government, led by Jawaharlal Nehru built into the Constitution. Although its current Prime Minister was swept to power on a wave of Hindu nationalism, and it ought to be said that some of his most ardent supporters, the RSS Shiv Sena constituency, are militantly anti-Muslim, Modi cannot ignore the fact that alienating such a massive minority would be a very high-risk policy indeed. And I think it's worth, when you think, well, why just before Christmas did he suddenly, unannounced, make a visit to Lahore to see Prime Minister Sharif? You have to remember that he is in exactly the same position relative to his own population and citizenry as the previous government. If I could just say that visit before Christmas was extraordinary, and of course it led to, whether there was a causal connection we don't know, but there was an immediate attack from Pakistan on a border post, and a very spirited Indian response to that attack. What is interesting is that it didn't bring the attempted reconciliation to an end, as it would have done. But it does, of course, illustrate one of the permanent constraints under which all Indian governments operate, which is that however much they want to move forward, there are going to be many wreckers on the Pakistan side of the border, but there are also plenty of wreckers on the Indian side of the border. And the Indian wreckers aren't all Muslim. There are many of them are Hindu, Dudfa and RSS and so on. So trying to normalize these relations with Pakistan is an uphill task. And it's also an uphill task because there's some truth in the Indian belief that while it would benefit from good cross-border relations on its own terms, admittedly, for Pakistan, opposition to India remains the essential raison d'etre of the state. This dates back to the successful advocacy of the two-nation theory on which the Pakistani state was based. But in the Indian view, it has been constantly reinforced by the role of the army in Pakistani politics, which the Indians view as a state within a state, and ultimately the real power in the land. So that even when they talk about the need for reconciliation with Pakistan, they tend to talk about it in terms of the elected authority in Pakistan, in order to draw the distinction between the allegedly democratic civilian government and the real power in the country. If the normalization of relations was to threaten the commanding position enjoyed by the armed forces in the allocation of resources, the ultimate justification of which is the need to match India's military modernization, it is questionable whether they would allow the reconciliation to continue. In any event, there are many spoilers on the Pakistani side, some of whom undoubtedly have links to the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence services, and cannot easily be written out of the political equation. You may have seen that former President Musharraf, despite the fact that he is now under house arrest, gave a public interview at the time of the Lahore meeting, criticizing it, distancing Pakistan from it. Well, what's all this to do with India's changing relations with the other great powers, the United States, but more particularly China and Russia? The short answer can be found in the most basic of all power political maxims. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And I suppose Philip talked about the importance of the balance of power in Southeast Asia. I think in Southern Asia, it is really the pattern of power which historically has been more important, and that the distinction being that the balance of power always raises questions of long-run strategic intent. Pattern of power is much more tactical. It is that if you've got an enemy pressing, you immediately reinsure with the person on the other side. And it has a long history in South and indeed in Central Asia. For India, given the array of smaller powers around its periphery, its own hegemonic position was always considered both natural and non-problematic. That India didn't harbour territorial or political ambitions was clear, at least it was clear to the Indians. And it was clear from the fact that they shared the anti-colonial credentials of their smaller neighbours, and that they had stood aside from Cold War rivalries by co-sponsoring the non-aligned movement. So at first sight, traditional geopolitical concepts like the pattern and balance of power were irrelevant to India's original foreign policy, at least so far as its public presentation was concerned. Closer scrutiny reveals a much more complicated picture. The original Indian view did not really convince any of India's smaller neighbours, wholly or for all of the time. From time to time, they were all apprehensive about India's regional weight and apt to seek reassurance through fostering relations with other, often more distant powers. But for Pakistan, this apprehension and need for reinsurance and reassurance were continuous from the foundation of the state. Pakistan sought to balance India by signing up to the Western side in the Cold War through joining first the Baghdad Pact, CENTO, and then SEATA. This had little immediate impact on India's foreign policy, which until 1962 continued to be driven by non-alignment in relation to the East-West conflict and by the Panchil principles in relation to China. These were the 5 principles of coexistence. A lot of water has flown under the bridge since then, but of course the Afghan crisis after 9/11 and the American-led invasion meant that Musharraf had to take the decision that when he was given an offer that he couldn't refuse by the United States. So America reinforced its relationship, which continues in a rather reduced and sometimes troubled way, but which still obviously affects the geopolitics of the whole region and the relations between India, the United States, and India and China, and India and Russia, incidentally. Everything changed, or began to change, after the short war between China and India and the decisive Chinese victory. The Western powers, the US following the UK in this regard, had always been frustrated by the Indo-Pak conflict. It should be said they're still frustrated, and they still don't, well, they do understand it, but they don't want to understand it. And they were constantly on the lookout for something that would persuade both countries to look in the same direction, to look at the same threat from outside to accept that China was the real problem. For India, at one level, that was always acceptable. The Indian nuclear program was always defended. Pakistan certainly thought it was about Pakistan. But the Indians, because they wanted to, they said, our hegemonic position is natural in South Asia. It was always about China and Russia ultimately, but China primarily. But what they weren't going to do on either side of the line of control between India and Pakistan was turn round and face in the same direction. They weren't going to do that after 1962, despite being prepared to accept arms from the West, and they weren't going to be prepared to do it after the 3-week war in 1965, and they weren't prepared to do it after 9/11 either. So they always failed. But equally, after these changes, the Western powers always concluded that they could not afford to pass up what chances that had been given them of providing even such limited military support to the world's largest democracy as they were able to the government of India would countenance. So it was not surprising that Pakistan, soon after 1962, decides to diversify away from its total dependence on the Western powers and to develop its special relationship with China, which persists to this day, and which has included, and Philip was talking about this in relation to other countries, has included a territorial compromise in lands which are part of the contested territory of Kashmir and which have been ceded in the Aksai Chin to China, making it doubly difficult to reach a resolution because two conflicts are involved. I mean, the Indians say that you have made a deal on Indian territory which is illegitimate, and the Chinese have built a road across it, and they aren't going to budge in any case. So Pakistan decided to diversify its external links, and its special relationship with China was developed, and India now found itself, non-aligned or not non-aligned, drawn into the geopolitical pattern of power that linked its bilateral relationship with Pakistan to the central East-West conflict. And that happened whether it liked it or not. So let me say something against that background about the current geopolitical great game in this part of the world. During the 19th century, Britain's interest in Tibet and Afghanistan was, as you know, fueled by the fear that the Russian Empire was going to encroach on its South Asian interests through the Himalayan passes along which previous conquerors of the subcontinent had always traveled. At that time, they didn't have to worry about China, which was in a weak state during the second. I mean, there's some doubt about how many centuries of humiliation there were, but I think they actually will sometimes talk about two, and this happened during the second of them. And of course, the present Chinese government often refers to this century of humiliation to draw a contrast with its current resurgence. The contemporary great game differs from its predecessor in that there are now 3 major regional players and 1 extra-regional one, plus several smaller powers whose strategic position still nonetheless gives them some leverage. China is now the country at the center of the game. Its strategic alliance with Pakistan is a legacy of its territorial disputes with India on the one hand and its rivalry with the Soviet Union on the other. India responded to its defeat by China by partially opening up to the West. This persuaded Pakistan that it must diversify its relations with the alliance with China without abandoning its relations with the United States. A decade later, in the context of the breakup of Pakistan, India signed a defense agreement with the Soviet Union to neutralize the alliance with the United States. From now on until last year, the Soviet Union, and after 1989, of course, Russia, as a successor power, always supported India diplomatically over Kashmir, as development of India's public sector heavy industry also supported that, and became India's main armourer, despite some Indian diversification to the West. Some of you may have noticed that France played a very prominent part in the Republic Day parades a couple of weeks ago, when they not only signed a major military Air Force deal, but sent troops to take part in the parade. I think the first time it's ever happened. I mean, this lock-in between Russia and India has weakened for both political and technical reasons, as India has diversified. Last year, the Russians suddenly announced that they were lifting their military sanctions on relations with Pakistan and would be prepared to provide military equipment, which immediately, of course, got Delhi very worried, because they began to wonder whether their sort of veto ally on the Kashmir question could be called in doubt. What did Modi do? Modi goes straight to Moscow, signs a whole lot of deals, and both sides say how absolutely vital the strategic partnership is, and so on. That is the mark of the Modi diplomatic style. So it has weakened the Russian investment, but not that much. To a considerable extent, it is embedded, and that it is moving away from the supply of military equipment to more and more joint ventures with material stuff being built in India, particularly by Hindustan Aerospace. On the other side of the Indo-Pakistan line of control, Pakistan could always rely on Chinese support diplomatically, economically, and politically. In return, Pakistan settled outstanding border issues, as I've suggested, including ceding land to China that India maintained had been seized illegally at the time of the Kashmir War in 1947. China's dramatic economic rise, which we have learned over the past 2 days, appears to be coming to an end, but a dramatic rise over the past 25 years, and its development of the One Belt, One Road strategy has altered the geopolitical equation for all the players, but particularly perhaps for India. In 2014, Russia signaled its desire to benefit from the Chinese Silk Road by, as I've suggested, liberalizing its economic relationship with Islamabad, something which alarmed the government, at least briefly, in Delhi. The problem was compounded because of the importance of China to India's own economic development, and it's now India's most important trade partner and an increasingly important investment source. And the fact that India risked losing out economically if it was not able to plug into the Chinese-sponsored transport and pipeline infrastructure because of its own territorial disputes with China. And there is, it has to be said, almost no political prospect that those can be quickly resolved. There's constant talk that they will be discussed without preconditions, but nobody budges. And it's not clear to me that either side can budge very, very quickly. The nearest thing, I mean, there is a solution of the Kashmir problem, which would unlock and undermine much of the argument that I'm advancing. It was advanced most notably by Musharraf and got very close before it was wrecked by forces on both sides. And this, of course, is to internationalize and accept the line of control, the effective partition of Kashmir between what Pakistanis call Azad Kashmir and what they call Indian occupied Kashmir, and vice versa. Rationally, many in India would be happy with such a solution, because they will say, we don't want another poor area of disaffected Muslim population which could act as a seedbed for terrorism, of which they've, after all, suffered a great deal. So there's a sort of rational solution from their point of view. But how do you get there? That was wrecked when Musharraf suggested it. The Indian government can't, and particularly an Indian government which is tried to manage its own support base, the RSS Shiv Sena, quite well, and has managed it quite well, but can't ignore it altogether. And that they would never, of course, abide by that. And there will be elements in the ISI which certainly wouldn't give up their revanchist position on the whole of Kashmir. So, although it's there in principle, although one can see a rational way forward, it would really need the fat man, ex-President Al-Tasari, to be even more of a genius than usual in bringing it about. So, how was India to fashion a foreign policy to protect its interests in the much more fluid and rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape than it had been used to since 1947? The Indian policy that has emerged has been dubbed multi-alignment. To differentiate it, no doubt, from India's traditional foreign policy of non-alignment, but also, of course, echoing it in India's refusal to make permanent commitments which may not support Indian interests. Modi has stamped his authority on this policy, but its framework, as I suggested, was largely created by his predecessor. And there are, I think, four aspects to the new policy, with which I will finish just by briefly summarizing. The first is a willingness to engage with as many countries as possible, wherever the Indians consider that such engagement can contribute to Indian economic development. The instrument of choice for this aspect of the policy is what they call the strategic partnership. The previous Congress-led alliance government under Manmohan Singh started negotiating these, particularly as part of the Look East policy, although it didn't pursue any of them with much energy. Modi has increased the number of such strategic partnership agreements dramatically and has tried to give them much more substance. He signs wherever he goes, and he goes to a great many countries all the time. He signs these agreements. He signed one with the UAE in 2014 and with the UK in 2015, as well as others, and all have specific investment projects itemized and framed and set up as part of it. The second aspect is a much more energetic Indian engagement with multilateral institutions than in the past, particularly those which have been set up in parallel, if not in open competition, with the Bretton Woods institutions, including the BRICS Development Bank, established in 2014, and India's decision to become a founding member of the Chinese-sponsored Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. India, along with Pakistan, has moved from observer status to full membership of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Modi has courted Beijing on the economic front in the hope of attracting Chinese infrastructural investment to balance that received from Japan, who, and the other very striking aspect of the Look East policy in this direction has been the reinforcement of India's relations with Japan, both in terms of inward investment. Japan is to build a high-speed railway, in terms of joint naval exercises, and so forth. I mean, there's always been quite a good relationship between India and Japan ever since the only member of the war trials tribunal to say that the verdicts were illegitimate was the Indian judge. And if you go to the Naksuni shrine, there is a great monument to this Indian judge. But that said, of course, until very recently, Naksuni shrine, I mean, it is one of the most controversial places in the Asian political firmament. Every time any politician goes to it, it causes a major row, not only in China but in Korea and so forth. But certainly there has been a drawing closer. It's not a terribly natural relationship. You could hardly think of culturally two more different countries than Japan and India, but they have been drawn together, again, on the enemy of my enemy is my friend principle. The third aspect is to leverage as many of these strategic partners to achieve the modernization of India's own economic infrastructure. The agreement with Japan, which I've just mentioned, is one thing, and it's been matched to some extent by China. India has also diversified its suppliers in the process of modernizing the armed forces, although overall Russia continues to hold a dominant position. Indeed, one reason for the diversification, in addition to multi-alignment for its own sake, is to persuade Russia to engage in joint venture projects that would allow India to emerge as a major defense manufacturer in its own right. The final aspect of the multi-alignment policy is to demonstrate that India is prepared to do whatever is necessary to defend its territory and interests. There's an obvious tension here between India's desire to engage as energetically as possible in the global economy, and I wish we had some Indians here, because I'm not certain how much of the Halper thesis they would accept. I think they still see the center of economic gravity moving relentlessly from the west to the east. That, I think, is the prevailing. I mean, of course, there's always a time warp in these things, but I suspect that is the case. So there is an obvious tension. But from the Indian point of view, it requires a policy of cooperation with both East and West, as well as competition with China, and its determination to robustly defend its territorial integrity and maritime interests. I've mentioned the militarization and increased capability of the Indian armed forces, particularly for high altitude warfare, which is what they perceive as the major threat in Arunachal Pradesh. But also at the time of Xi's visit, and it was I think one has to hand it to Modi, he has been extraordinarily adroit in building diplomatic strategic partnerships with the West, with the United States, with China, with Japan, reinforcing it with Russia. He doesn't appear to have put a foot wrong diplomatically. He's had some problems domestically, particularly in Bihar, where he mucked up the election. But diplomatically he's been very successful. But at the time, just to sort of show, and it fits with a lot of what we've heard on Chinese policy from Stephan and Philip, the time of Xi's visit last November, which was a great success, the Chinese nonetheless advanced quite a long way into Indian territory in Leh. And just as in Pakantot, immediately Modi sent a brigade up to there, and the Chinese withdrew, which is a much more robust response than you have seen previously. I'll leave it there. Thank you.